And we begin with Hong Kong, where leader Carrie Lam was forced to suspend her annual address this morning after being heckled in the city's legislature. Opposition lawmakers disrupted the session from the start by shouting slogans. Pro-democracy lawmakers shouted 5 demands, not one less. After a first interruption, the session briefly resumed, only to be interrupted again.
我今日發表任內第3份施政報告，詳細內容載列於政府。
It was then adjourned for a second time, with the address delivered by pre-recorded video instead. Carrie Lam said that the government will continue to uphold the one country, two systems formula. She also said that the government will not tolerate calls for independence or anything that hurts China's national security or sovereignty. The legislature resumed its sitting on Wednesday for the first time since it was stormed by protesters back in the month of July this year. The Legislative Council was expected to officially withdraw the extradition bill that sparked the protests. The withdrawal will only be possible once the session resumes. Carrie Lam faces immense pressure to regain trust and resolve the city's biggest political crisis. Our correspondent Patrick Falk now joins us live from Hong Kong with the latest on that front. Patrick, talk to us. It was an important day when the legislature was supposed to withdraw officially the extradition bill, but the protests have made sure that that first demand of the 5 demands does not get completed.
Yeah, that's right. It's been a very dramatic day indeed. There were, of course, doubts about whether or not this policy address was going to get underway at all in the first place. Doubts about whether or not Carrie Lam would make it down to the building just behind me because there were reports saying that protesters had planned to block her way from getting here. But she did get down here in good time, about half an hour before the policy address was meant to begin. So that wasn't the problem. There were, in fact, very few protesters around here this morning. It was when she began delivering that address in Legco that pro-democracy lawmakers heckled and shouted and called for the resignation of the chief executive, as you mentioned. And she tried to begin the address twice, but eventually it had to be adjourned and Carrie Lam had to deliver the address via video link. So there obviously was some expectation that she would be disrupted and that a contingency plan had been made. But as many people expected, the expectations for the policy address were rather low, and she doesn't seem to have appeased either pro-establishment lawmakers or pro-democracy lawmakers. A lot said about housing and land supply, but very little in the form of political reform, and that's going to disappoint a lot of people in Hong Kong.
Right. Patrick, talk to us what happens from now, because at the end of the day, the legislature will have to convene for anything to happen with the extradition bill that sparked these protests in the first place.
Yeah, well, that's the other thing, of course, that people will be disappointed that the extradition bill hasn't been formally withdrawn. That was meant to be happening today. But, of course, because the policy address had to be adjourned, that also meant that John Lee, the Secretary for Security, wasn't able to do that. We are told now that that's going to go ahead next Wednesday. But that's something that's just going to mean that the matter is still hanging over Hong Kongers' heads. There's no sign of any protest or unrest today, however. Although, as I say, a lot of people will be rather disappointed with what they've heard today.
And Patrick, also give us an update on what the situation is like on the streets of Hong Kong in terms of the protests.
Well, as I say, there's no unrest for the time being. There had been expectations that perhaps some people might have come out on the back of the policy address. There's been heavy security all around Legco today. maybe this morning around 100, 200 police officers dressed in full riot gear. But as I say, there's been no unrest. It's been very calm indeed. There were lots of security personnel inside the MTR stations. Of course, they've been the focus of a lot of vandalism over the past several weeks. There could still be some sort of protest that takes place later on this evening. Of course, it's the middle of a working week. There have been some lunchtime marches that have taken place in recent weeks, but nothing so far.
Right. Patrick also talked to us about the fact that now there's a clear asking for support from the U.S. that's emanating from Hong Kong. We've seen those protests with the American flags, but Beijing has clearly warned anybody against intervening in its own affairs.
Yeah, that's right. We heard from Beijing earlier that they accused the US of having sinister motives and said that they were trying to destroy Hong Kong. That was something that was echoed by Carrie Lam today as well, saying that any talk of independence or any attempts to separate Hong Kong from China simply wouldn't be tolerated. But this is a significant development that's taken place overnight in the US, which could put some pressure on the local government as well as the central government. It also creates further complications in the ongoing trade talks between Washington and Beijing. Essentially, the House of Representatives has passed the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. That means that the US is going to have to review annually whether or not to keep its special economic and trade status for Hong Kong, depending on whether or not it feels that Hong Kong is sufficiently autonomous. And also it would see certain individuals potentially being sanctioned if they are seen to be curtailing freedoms in Hong Kong. In addition, it will also mean that the US will stop selling any anti-protest weaponry, things like rubber bullets and tear gas. So there are three significant issues there, and we're also told that it's highly likely that this will now pave the way for the bill to be passed in the US Senate.
Patrick Falk joining us live with an update straight from Hong Kong. Patrick, thank you so much for being with us here on Wion World is Back. Now, keeping it with the US
unemployed or underemployed.
And its support for Hong Kong. We have Carrie Lam, the leader of Hong Kong, now addressing the media. Let's listen in.
Two packages in August and September. The first package has a price tag of $19.1 billion to help a range of people and also provide various initiatives. The second package concentrated on SMEs. I can tell you that the Financial Secretary is drawing up a third package, hopefully to be released later this month, because the situation keeps on evolving. So whenever the government notices that there are certain things that we should do because of the economic downturn, I can promise you that we will do it. We are not waiting. So the Financial Secretary has not waited for my policy address, and he is not waiting for his budget speech next February. So we will continue to do those measures. The second question is about political legitimacy and my ability to govern. Of course, I understand that as a result of these 4 months social unrest, many people are very unhappy with the situation and even with the government, because we could not promise them when things will go back to normal. And for some of those, we could not promise them the things that they want us to do. But that doesn't mean that we have no will to continue to govern. The will and the determination to govern is still there. That's why, despite the pressure and the time constraint in the last few months, my colleagues have put together a very substantive policy address and a policy address supplement with over 220 initiatives. And we will put our mind together to implement all these initiatives. I will continue to accord importance to relationship with Legislative Council members across the political spectrum. But this is not something that I could do unilaterally. For example, I understand that the Chief Secretary for Administration has tried to engage the non-pro-establishment members to sit down to talk about the prioritization of the funding proposals so that we could do what we do, what I used to do last year. That is, let's deal with the easier items, 先易後難. Let's deal with the easier items in the Finance Committee and put back the difficult items. But apparently they did not want to talk. So this is not something that I could control, but we will continue to attach importance to. Now, of course, Hong Kong, under one country, two systems, we have our own system. We have our own way of commenting and responding to issues. So I would suggest that there's no need for you to draw a comparison between how we say something and how the central government said something, because we are different. And so we will, but the same frustration and disappointment and regret exists in either the Hong Kong SAR government or the Central People's Government, because this Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act is totally unjustified and unwarranted. It will hurt not only the Hong Kong business, it will hurt American interests in Hong Kong. They have 1,400 companies, 85,000 citizens in Hong Kong who have taken Hong Kong as a home. They work here, they invest here. So to have that sort of act creating a lot of uncertainties will also damage the business confidence and, in turn, the businesses' prospects in Hong Kong.
最後呢位網媒嘅朋友。
Final question from an online media. I'm from Stan News. My name is Chen. I have two questions. First of all, Mrs. Lam, in the past two policy addresses, there's a dedicated chapter on the youth, and now this time
that is the Hong Kong senator Carrie Lam, who was heckled in the Parliament earlier in the day, addressing the media. Keep in mind the Parliament session was suspended as opposition lawmakers disrupted the session.